By the time Ignaz Semmelweis died in August of 1865, the world was not treating him like a medical pioneer. It was treating him like an embarrassment, not a man who had seen something historic, not a man who had cut through one of the deadliest mysteries in 19th century medicine, not a man who had found a way to save mothers who were dying in childbirth. A nuisance, a failure, a man many educated people would have preferred to stop hearing from. He died at 47 after being committed to an asylum near Vienna, where he was restrained, badly handled, and dead within 2 weeks. The exact medical and psychiatric details of his final days are still debated, but the broad outline is not. He died of sepsis, the same kind of lethal infection he had spent his career trying to stop. That is the end of the story. The beginning is worse, because a few years earlier, Semmelweis had made a discovery so important that modern medicine now treats it as almost embarrassingly obvious. Doctors should wash their hands before examining patients, not as a gesture, not as a polished habit, as a life-and-death intervention. He imposed hand disinfection with chlorinated lime in a maternity clinic in Vienna, and the death rate collapsed. That part is not folklore. That part is numbers. Today that sounds almost too simple to be heroic. Wash your hands. That is the kind of sentence printed on daycare walls. The kind of thing a parent tells a child before lunch. The kind of instructions so basic that people stopped noticing how much history had to bleed before it became normal. But in the 1840s, in one of the most prestigious hospitals in Europe, that idea did not land like common sense. It landed like an accusation, because Semmelweis was not simply telling doctors to be cleaner. He was telling doctors that they were carrying death on their hands, not metaphorically, literally. And once that accusation entered the room, this stopped being a medical debate. It became a fight over shame. That is the engine of this whole story. Not hygiene by itself, not science by itself. Shame. Semmelweis was right in a way that made too many powerful men look unforgivable. And that is why the system reacted the way it did. Not with gratitude, with defense. If you walked into Vienna General Hospital in the 1840s, you would have entered one of the great medical institutions of Europe. Semmelweis joined its obstetric service in 1846 at what was then the largest maternity hospital in the world. But if you were a pregnant woman, reputation was not the same thing as safety. That is the first contradiction. The hospital was a place of training, expertise, prestige, and professional ambition. It was also, for many women, a place of terror, because childbirth in that environment carried a second risk beyond labor itself. You might survive the birth and still die from the doctors. The hospital had 2 maternity clinics. That detail sounds administrative. It wasn't. It was the crack in the whole system. The first clinic was staffed by doctors and medical students. The second clinic was staffed by midwives and student midwives. Patients were admitted on alternating days, which meant the hospital accidentally created something close to a natural comparison between 2 systems treating similar patients in the same institution. And the numbers were horrifying. From 1840 through 1846, the maternal mortality rate in the first clinic was 98.4 per 1,000 births. In the second clinic, it was 36.2 per 1,000. Same hospital, same city, same era. Wildly different odds of survival. Most of those deaths were from puerperal fever, also called childbed fever, a devastating postpartum infection that haunted maternity hospitals throughout Europe. That gap was not subtle. It was visible. Women knew it. They feared it. Some begged not to be admitted to the first clinic. Some reportedly went into labor in the street and tried to claim they had already delivered before reaching the hospital, simply to avoid being assigned to the wrong ward. Imagine how bad a hospital has to be before poor women would rather give birth outside than enter the doctor-run side of the building. And that is where the story gets almost unbearable, because the deadliest ward was not the one run by the ignorant. It was the one run by the educated. The more elite side of the hospital was producing worse outcomes than the side staffed by midwives. That should have been impossible. It was happening in public. Everyone could see it. And yet for years, the institution could not. or would not, explain it. This is where modern people tend to misunderstand the story. They imagine Semmelweis stepping into the hospital already knowing the answer. He didn't. He was not walking around with textbook germ theory in his pocket. Pasteur had not yet given medicine the microbial explanation that later made everything look so clear. Semmelweis did not have the full map. What he had was something messier and more dangerous. He had a pattern no one else seemed willing to treat as a crime scene. That matters because it makes him more impressive, not less. He did not discover the truth because his age handed him the theory. He discovered it because the bodies kept lining up in a way his mind refused to call normal. That is a very different kind of intelligence. Not polished theory first. Moral discomfort first. He looked at the mortality gap and refused to explain it away with fatalism. That sounds small. It isn't. A lot of people can think clearly as long as nothing important depends on the answer. Semmelweis was thinking inside a ward where the answer was measured in dead mothers. That changes the pressure of every question. At that time, medicine offered plenty of explanations for childbed fever, overcrowding, poor ventilation, bad air, miasma, seasonal effects, fear, moral or constitutional weakness. Theories multiplied because certainty was missing, and uncertainty has a way of protecting institutions. If a cause is vague enough, responsibility stays vague too. Bad air does not have a face. Miasma does not have a salary. Overcrowding does not sign the death register. But if the cause turns out to be something specific, and especially if it is something the staff themselves are doing, then uncertainty becomes blame. That is the bridge Semmelweis eventually crossed. And once he crossed it, there was no safe way back. At first, he investigated like a disciplined skeptic. He looked at crowding. He looked at labor practices. He looked at ventilation. He looked at whether patients in the two clinics were somehow different. He even considered whether the sight of a priest entering the ward to administer last rites was frightening women so badly that it worsened outcomes. That sounds strange now, but in a world without germ theory, people were testing everything they could imagine. One by one, those explanations failed. The two clinics were too similar in too many ways. The difference had to be in what the staff were doing, not what the building was doing, not what fate was doing. The killer was procedural. That is a terrifying category of truth, because procedural truth means the system is not merely unlucky. The system is producing the deaths. And this is the part that turns the story from medical history into something closer to a thriller. Semmelweis knew the killer was in the room. He just didn't know its name yet. That is an awful place to stand. To know women are dying from something human-made. To know it is happening inside the routines of care. To know the institution itself contains the mechanism. And to not yet be able to point at the exact hand, the exact practice, the exact transfer. It is one thing to suspect disaster. It is another to suspect that disaster is happening through the very people everyone else calls healers. That is why Semmelweis's story grips people even now. Because the medical revelation is only half of it. The other half is psychological. He was slowly realizing that the people in charge of rescue might be acting as couriers of death. Once that suspicion enters your mind, every routine looks different. Every examination becomes a question. Every white apron starts to look less like authority and more like a disguise. And then came the death that broke the case open. In 1847, Semmelweis's friend and colleague Jacob Kolechka died after suffering a wound during an autopsy. The pathological findings in his body resembled what Semmelweis had seen again and again in women who died of puerperal fever. That resemblance hit him with enormous force. That is the kind of moment movies love to fake. This one was real. A friend dies from a wound sustained in the dissecting room. The body shows the same internal devastation seen in dead mothers. Suddenly, two separate tragedies are not separate anymore. They are one mechanism wearing two different faces. That is when the shape of the truth finally emerged. Doctors and medical students in the first clinic began their days in the autopsy room. Then they moved into the maternity ward. They did not properly disinfect their hands. They examined laboring women. The midwives in the second clinic did not perform autopsies and did not carry the same cadaver contact into obstetric examinations. There it was, not in the air, not in the walls, not in the moral weakness of the mothers, on the hands of the doctors. Semmelweis called it cadaverous matter. That phrase is clumsy by modern standards. It is also magnificent, because without modern microbiology, he had still found the essential truth. Something from the dead was being transported into the living. And childbirth, with its wounds, its examinations, its vulnerability, gave that contamination a direct road into the body. Once Semmelweis understood that, the difference between the two clinics stopped being mysterious. The doctor-run clinic was not simply more dangerous by chance. It was acting like a delivery system, not for babies, for infection. That is one of the most brutal reversals in the history of medicine. The institution built to train modern doctors had accidentally become a machine for carrying death from corpses to mothers. And now Semmelweis faced the next question. Could it be stopped? He did not wait for philosophy to calm down. He did not wait for a grand consensus. He intervened. In May 1847, he required doctors and students in the first clinic to wash their hands with chlorinated lime before entering the maternity ward. He chose chlorinated lime because it removed the smell of decay more effectively than ordinary soap and water. To him, that smell mattered because it signaled the deadly material he believed they were carrying from the autopsy room. The staff hated it. The solution was harsh. It irritated the skin. It took time. It was humiliating. And that last one may have mattered most, because every enforced wash was also a confession. Every doctor forced to scrub was being told, in effect, you are not entering this ward as a clean gentleman of science. You are entering it as a possible source of contamination. That insult was built into the procedure. Even before the numbers came back, the social wound had already opened. But then the numbers came back, and they were devastating. Britannica summarizes the result this way. Mortality in his division dropped from 18.27% to 1.27% after hand disinfection, and in March and August of 1848, no women died in childbirth in his division. Other historical reviews give slightly different annual and monthly breakdowns, but they agree on the main point. Once chlorinated hand washing began, the first clinic's mortality rate collapsed and became comparable to the midwives' clinic. That should have ended the argument. A deadly pattern had been identified. A simple intervention had been imposed. The deaths fell. What more do you need? Quite a lot, apparently, if the truth comes wrapped in humiliation, because the data did not merely say, here is a better procedure. It said something much more poisonous to professional pride. It said, you were the difference. Not bad air. Not fate. Not the weakness of women. You. That is the point where a scientific dispute becomes a war over identity. And identity almost always fights dirtier than evidence. If you want to understand why Semmelweis was rejected, you have to stop telling yourself that all he was offering was hand washing. He wasn't. Hand washing was the method. The real payload was accusation. That is the second engine of this story. His opponents were not simply being asked to update a protocol. They were being asked to reinterpret their past as lethal. That is not a small adjustment. That is moral demolition. Try to hear Semmelweis's discovery the way a senior physician in Vienna might have heard it. You are a trained man, an educated man, a man whose profession claims dignity, reason, science, and social authority. You work in one of Europe's great hospitals. And now a younger colleague is effectively telling you that your routine has been carrying a death signal from dissected corpses into living women. If he is right, then your respectability is contaminated. If he is right, then many women died not because medicine was helpless, but because medicine was dirty. If he is right, then your hands helped kill the people you were supposed to save. That is not an intellectual inconvenience. That is shame with a body count. And shame, especially elite shame, can trigger a level of resistance that looks insane from the outside and perfectly reasonable from the inside. This is why the lazy version of the story, genius hero versus stupid villains, doesn't go deep enough. The men who resisted Semmelweis were wrong, sometimes monstrously wrong. But many of them were not simply choosing nonsense over evidence, because they were uniquely foolish. They were choosing a version of reality they could emotionally survive. That distinction matters, because it is one of the most dangerous patterns in history. Humans do not only reject ideas because the ideas are weak. They reject them because the ideas accuse too much. And Semmelweis's ideas accused everything. They accused training. They accused hierarchy. They accused routine. They accused the medical ego itself. There was also a second problem. Semmelweis had the right intervention before medicine had the accepted theory that would make the intervention feel respectable. He did not yet have bacteriology in modern form. He had no completed germ theory. Pasteur had not yet provided the framework that later made infection control intellectually legible to everyone else. So Semmelweis was asking the profession to accept a humiliating practical truth before the reigning theoretical culture was ready to digest it. That should not have mattered as much as it did. But theory is often used as a shield by people who are really defending something else. Status. If you cannot openly say, "I refuse this because it makes me look guilty," you say, "I refuse this because the explanatory mechanism is incomplete." That sounds more scientific. It also buys more time. And time, in this case, meant more women dying under old routines. That is one reason this story still feels so modern, because institutions rarely say, "We reject this because it embarrasses us." They say, "The evidence is interesting, but premature." Or, "The theory remains underdeveloped." Or, "Further study is needed." Sometimes that caution is wise. Sometimes it is cowardice, wearing academic language. Semmelweis ran straight into that distinction. What made his case even more intolerable was that the comparison inside Vienna General Hospital was so humiliating. The midwives' clinic was safer. That is a reputational disaster if you are a physician inside an elite institution, because now the issue is not only that infection is spreading. The issue is that the supposedly more advanced side of the building is doing worse than the supposedly less learned side. Education itself appears compromised. Training itself appears dangerous. The entire prestige ladder starts to wobble. Semmelweis was not just lowering mortality. He was inverting the social hierarchy of competence. That is another reason the reaction was so fierce. He made medicine look less like progress and more like contamination wrapped in ceremony. At that point, the hospital had a choice. It could say, "The evidence is ugly, but we follow it." Or it could say, "The evidence is insulting, so we isolate the man." Institutions often surprise people here. They do not always choose accuracy. They often choose self-protection. Semmelweis's superior, Johann Klein, did not become his great defender. Semmelweis's position in Vienna weakened, and broader politics made everything worse. The revolutionary upheavals of 1848 reshaped Central Europe, and Semmelweis's Hungarian identity did not help him in a Vienna marked by post-revolutionary suspicion and hardening loyalties. By 1849 to 1850, he had been pushed to the margins and eventually left for Pest. That part of the story is brutal because it destroys one of the most comforting myths people have about evidence. People like to imagine that once the numbers are strong enough, the discoverer becomes safe. Not true. Sometimes strong numbers make a discoverer more dangerous to the system, not less, because strong numbers reduce the number of excuses available to the people at the top. Weak evidence can be ignored politely. Strong evidence that carries blame has to be neutralized socially. That is exactly what happened to Semmelweis. He was not just a man with a method. He was a living reminder that the old method had been killing women. You can see why the system might prefer him gone, not murdered in some conspiratorial sense. Something more ordinary, more respectable, more familiar, marginalized, dismissed, kept out of the center. That is how institutions often punish threats. Not always with overt violence at first, with professional thinning, with distance, with the slow removal of oxygen. And yet the story gets worse, because his ideas, did not stop working after Vienna pushed him away. He moved to Pest and worked at St. Rochus Hospital, where his measures again produced very low maternal mortality. Britannica reports that from 1851 to 1855, only 8 women died of childbed fever out of 933 births there, about 0.85%. In other words, once again, the practice worked. That is one of the most painful facts in the entire story. He kept being right. This was not a fluke in one ward under one set of peculiar conditions. The same logic worked again. The intervention remained valid. The lives saved remained real. And still much of the broader establishment did not fully bend. That should tell you something essential. The problem was no longer whether the method worked. The problem was whether the culture could bear what the method meant. This is where Semmelweis begins to change as a character. And if you want the truth, this is where he becomes harder to romanticize in simple terms. He did not respond to rejection by becoming infinitely patient, infinitely diplomatic, infinitely polished. He became angrier, more brittle, more accusatory, more impossible for his enemies to ignore and easier for them to portray as unstable. That is not an attack on him. It is a tragedy. Because one of the ugliest things a system can do is force a truth-teller into a tone that can later be used to discredit the truth itself. Ignore a man while women die under routines he has shown to be deadly, and eventually his restraint may burn away. Then the same people who ignored him can point at his fury and say, "See, he is unreasonable." There is something almost perfect in that cruelty. It is not enough to reject the evidence. The system also wants to recruit the dissenter's emotional collapse as proof that rejection was wise. Semmelweis began writing more aggressively. He eventually published his large treatise on childbed fever in 1860 to 1861, but many historians note that it was delayed, sprawling, repetitive, and mixed great clarity with bellicose attacks on opponents. He also wrote open letters to leading obstetricians, denouncing them in extreme terms, and sometimes calling them effectively responsible for mothers' deaths. Strategically, this was disastrous. Morally, it is impossible not to see how he got there. Imagine living with the knowledge that the deaths are preventable. Imagine watching institutions that could reduce them refuse, because the reduction requires public humility. Imagine holding the data. Imagine watching the data lose socially to ego. How calm would you stay? How long would you keep speaking as if the disagreement were merely technical? At some point, for Semmelweis, the argument stopped feeling scientific and started feeling criminal. That shift is dangerous. Once you begin talking that way, you may be morally closer to the truth and rhetorically further from persuasion. But again, that is what makes this story bigger than one doctor. It is a study in how systems metabolize threat. At first they ignore, then they minimize, then they isolate, then, if needed, they reinterpret the dissenter's emotional state as the main issue. Notice how convenient that last move is. Once Semmelweis could be discussed as a difficult man, an obsessive man, or a disturbed man. The conversation could drift away from the ward mortality numbers and toward his personality. That is one of the oldest tricks in institutional self-defense. Move the spotlight from the bodies to the messenger, from the statistics to the style, from the evidence to the temperament. And if the messenger is genuinely unraveling, the trick becomes even easier. It is worth saying plainly that Semmelweis was not a flawless public persuader. He was not a cool strategist. He was not one of those historical figures who somehow remains perfectly emotionally composed while the world humiliates him. He was brilliant. He was empirically sharp. He was morally furious. And over time, he became increasingly hard to manage, increasingly combative, and increasingly vulnerable to being framed as unwell. Historians and later medical writers describe him as dogmatic, intolerant of criticism, and by the early 1860s likely in decline. The exact nature of that decline remains debated. That debate matters, because it prevents the story from collapsing into lazy melodrama. Was he suffering from burnout? Depression? A degenerative neurological condition? Neurosyphilis? Some combination of mental and physical deterioration? Scholars have proposed multiple possibilities, and none closes the case completely. But the exact diagnosis is not the deepest point. The deeper point is that rejection changed him. Not merely emotionally, socially, professionally, existentially. His discovery did not become a stable platform. It became a wound that kept opening every time another authority dismissed what he had proven in blood and numbers. That kind of wound does not stay clean. And by the time his behavior was visibly worsening, the establishment could enjoy the moral convenience of saying, "Look at him," not, "Look at the mortality tables." That is why this story is still so useful as a warning, because it shows how a system can survive being wrong. It simply shifts the conversation until the wrongness no longer occupies center stage. Meanwhile, the dissenting person becomes the main exhibit. That is what happened to Semmelweis. He was gradually transformed, in the eyes of many contemporaries, from the man with the evidence into the man with the problem personality. That move does not disprove him. It makes the social mechanics of his defeat easier to understand. And then history added one more layer of cruelty. The phrase Semmelweis reflex later emerged to describe the instinctive rejection of new evidence because it contradicts established beliefs or norms. The term itself came much later, but it survived because his story captured a pattern that people kept recognizing in other fields. What is striking about that phrase is how neat it sounds compared with the life it came from. Semmelweis reflex sounds like a concept, a useful term, a clean piece of intellectual vocabulary, but underneath it is something filthy, a profession so invested in its own dignity that it resisted a life-saving correction because the correction was humiliating. That is not just bad science. It is self-protective cruelty. And once you see that clearly, the story stops being only about 19th century obstetrics. It becomes a wider story about how human beings behave when truth arrives carrying judgment. Because people love innovation in the abstract. What they hate is a form of innovation that says, the old way was not merely incomplete. The old way was killing people. That is what Semmelweis discovered. Not just contamination. Verdict. His hand-washing protocol was not merely a new technique. It was a ruling against the old order. And old orders do not surrender just because the ruling is correct. They make the ruling expensive. He was about to discover just how expensive. By the early 1860s, Semmelweis was carrying too many battles at once. He was fighting the memory of the women who had died before his protocol. He was fighting the refusal of medical authorities to admit what his results meant. He was fighting his own reputation, which was steadily shifting from difficult pioneer toward obsessive crank. And he was likely fighting some form of genuine mental or neurological decline that modern historians still argue over. That is an impossible load for one person to carry cleanly, especially a person whose central insight had never really stopped being correct. This is where the story becomes harder than the easy legend people remember. The easy legend says, he was right. They laughed. History vindicated him. All true. Also much too clean. The real story is not clean. The real story is about what prolonged non-recognition does to a human being. It does not merely delay applause. It alters the person who has to live inside the delay. Semmelweis did not get to be a serene prophet. He had to be a man watching preventable death survive argument after argument. That kind of life corrodes people. And by 1865, something had given way. His behavior had become alarming enough to those around him that his family and associates arranged to have him taken to Vienna and placed in an asylum. Different accounts vary in detail, but the broad outline is consistent. He did not go there as a calm, voluntary patient fully aware of the plan. He realized what was happening and resisted. That moment is one of the darkest in the whole story, because even without embellishment, it carries unbearable irony. The man who had spent years trying to stop institutional care from killing patients was now being swallowed by an institution himself. And institutions are often at their most frightening when they decide a difficult person is no longer a colleague, not even really a citizen, but a body to be contained. Once a system classifies you that way, compassion gets thinner very fast. Accounts and later analyses indicate that he was restrained and badly abused after trying to escape. Recently discussed autopsy material has strengthened the case that he suffered serious injuries, likely including wounds to his right hand, and later died of generalized sepsis. Some details remain debated, but the possibility of abuse is no longer fringe speculation. That matters because many popular retellings of Semmelweis go too far in one direction or the other. Some turn it into a cartoon torture scene. Some sanitize it into a vague, sad ending. The truth is worse than the sanitized version and more complicated than the cartoon. He was committed. He resisted. He was badly handled. He suffered injuries. He died within 2 weeks. And he died of infection. That is enough. You do not need to exaggerate a story when the uncontested parts already cut this deep. He died on August 13, 1865. Britannica notes that he died 2 weeks into confinement from infection of a wound on his right hand, possibly acquired when he was beaten by guards. Try to sit with that sentence for a second. The man who taught doctors that contamination on the hands could kill patients died from an infected wound after being confined in an institution where his own body was not kept safe. It is almost too perfect as an irony, which is why people often tell it too neatly. But real irony is rarely neat. This one is filthy. It says something vicious about the 19th century. It also says something timeless about how badly systems can treat a person once they have downgraded him from colleague to problem. And here the story performs one last twist. Semmelweis did not live to enjoy the intellectual rescue that would have made his discovery easier for others to accept. Pasteur's work later helped establish germ theory more firmly, and Joseph Lister drew on that microbial logic in developing antiseptic surgery. In hindsight, that later framework made Semmelweis's observations look not only empirically strong, but theoretically inevitable. But none of that arrived in time to stabilize his life. This is one of the cruelest patterns in the history of science. The first person sees the truth in messy form. The later person arrives with the cleaner explanation. The world then applauds the cleaner explanation as if the messy truth-teller had merely been an unfortunate preliminary act. Semmelweis did not invent all of antiseptic medicine. That would be too broad. But he recognized, with extraordinary practical precision, that caregivers were transmitting lethal contamination and that disciplined disinfection could slash mortality. That should have been enough. Historically, it wasn't. He needed theory to arrive behind him like reinforcements. Instead, theory arrived after he was dead. That delay is not just sad. It is instructive. Because people often think truth fails when it lacks evidence. Not always. Sometimes truth fails because it lacks timing. Sometimes a person is right before the social machinery exists to metabolize the rightness. Sometimes the evidence is already strong enough to save lives, but not yet wrapped in the language powerful people require before they will bend. Semmelweis lived and died inside that timing gap, which is why his story remains so haunting. He was not just early. He was early in a way that implicated the present too much. The world was eventually willing to honor him. That part is easy now. There is a Semmelweis University in Budapest. There are statues, museums, titles. He is remembered as the savior of mothers, and that phrase is deserved. But retrospective honor is cheap. It demands nothing from the dead. It asks nothing of the institutions that once resisted. It lets later generations feel morally cleaner than the people in the story without asking whether they would have behaved any better under similar pressure. That is why I think the praise around Semmelweis always carries a shadow. Every monument to him also says this, whether the inscription admits it or not. Too late. Too late for him. Too late for the mothers who died before his method spread. Too late for the people who could have acted sooner if they had been more willing to accept humiliation in exchange for truth. That is the hidden text carved under every public tribute. And maybe that is why the Semmelweis story still grips people who are not even especially interested in medical history. Because at its core, this is not just a story about infection. It is a story about what institutions do when the correction they need also feels like self-indictment. That pattern has not vanished. Not in medicine, not in politics, not in science, not in corporations, not in academia, not anywhere human beings build status systems and then discover that the status system itself may be producing harm. Semmelweis is not just a doctor from the 1840s. He is the patron figure of an unbearable sentence. The evidence is clear, but accepting it would make us look guilty. Once that sentence enters a room, truth becomes socially expensive, and socially expensive truths are often delayed, diluted, or redirected until the original speaker has been broken, forgotten, or safely buried. That is why the phrase Semmelweis reflex survived, because it names something humiliatingly durable in human behavior. We do not merely reject new ideas because they are strange. We reject them because they threaten identity, rank, routine, and innocence. Now think about how brutal that dynamic was in Semmelweis's case. He was not asking doctors to accept a harmless little correction. He was asking them to absorb the possibility that their prestige had been built alongside an avoidable trail of maternal death. That is a morally radioactive proposition. Once it becomes real, every old confidence starts to smell different. Your training is different. Your ward rounds are different. Your autopsy lessons are different. Your memory of dead patients is different. And most of all, your self-image is different. No one wants that kind of revision, which is exactly why so many people choose some version of the psychological bargain. Better to reject the correction than to reinterpret the past. Semmelweis was standing against that bargain, and for a while, the bargain beat him. It beat him professionally. It beat him socially. And in the end, perhaps almost literally, there's another hard truth hidden in this story. People often ask whether Semmelweis would have succeeded sooner if he had been calmer, more diplomatic, more strategic, more polished. Maybe. Maybe if he had published earlier in a more elegant style. Maybe if he had offended fewer colleagues. Maybe if he had not written rage-filled letters. Maybe if he had been easier to admire. Those are fair questions. They are also slightly dangerous questions, because they can shift too much weight back onto the person who was already carrying the truth. The women in the first clinic did not need a better public intellectual. They needed cleaner hands. That is the part no amount of later nuance should blur. Yes, Semmelweis became harder to persuade with and harder to champion. Yes, his style damaged his cause. Yes, history is full of people who were right in substance and disastrous in self-presentation. All true. And still, the profession had enough evidence to change more than it did. That responsibility does not disappear because the messenger became painful to deal with. It is tempting to end the story with vindication. Pasteur confirms the microbial world. Lister builds antiseptic surgery on principles that keep bacteria from entering wounds. Modern infection control rises. Semmelweis wins in the end. That ending is tidy. It is also false in an important way. He did not win in the end. His idea won. He did not. That distinction matters, because people use vindication too casually, as if later agreement repairs earlier cruelty. It doesn't. If anything, later agreement can make earlier cruelty look even worse. The more fully Semmelweis was proven right by the future, the uglier the conduct of the present appears. That is the real retrospective effect, not healing. Exposure. The future did not save him. It exposed how unnecessary his isolation had been. And maybe that is the most chilling part of the whole story. He was not destroyed by a lack of data. He was not destroyed by some mysterious natural limit of 19th century knowledge alone. He was destroyed by a culture that found it easier to pathologize the man than to absorb the accusation in his evidence. That is a very different kind of tragedy. More modern, more recognizable, more upsetting, because it means the gap between life-saving truth and social acceptance is not just about intelligence. It is about moral courage, and moral courage is often in shorter supply than intelligence. The doctors around Semmelweis were not lacking brains. Many were lacking the ability to say, "If this humiliates us, then we deserve to be humiliated." That sentence would have saved lives. Instead, a profession chose self-respect over rapid correction, and mothers paid the price. That is why I think Semmelweis' story should never be reduced to the father of handwashing. That phrase is true. it is also much too soft. He was not merely an early hygiene advocate. He was a man who forced medicine to confront the possibility that its rituals of education and authority had become channels of death. That is bigger than hand washing. That is a threat to the moral architecture of a profession. And professions do not forgive that quickly. Not even now. Maybe especially not now. Because the most uncomfortable part of the Semmelweis story is not that people in the 1840s were wrong. People in every decade are wrong. The uncomfortable part is how recognizable their wrongness feels. How familiar the sequence is. A hidden harm becomes visible. The data points inward, toward the institution itself. The institution hesitates. The dissenter becomes difficult. The focus shifts from victims to tone. Time passes. The correction eventually enters through a safer door. Then everyone pretends progress was inevitable. That sequence should make you feel cold. Because once you see it in Semmelweis, you start seeing it everywhere. And that means the story is not over. Not really. It just keeps changing costumes. So what, finally, is the fairest way to remember him? Not as a saint untouched by flaw. Not as a madman accidentally right. As something much more human and much more frightening. A brilliant observer who discovered that routine medical behavior was killing mothers. A man who proved that cleaner hands could stop it. A man who lacked the theoretical language and social leverage to make power surrender quickly. A man whose own rage and decline became part of the machinery used against him. A man whom history later honored, because history could afford to be brave after the cost had already been paid. And if that sounds less comforting than the schoolbook version, good. It should. Because this story is not supposed to comfort you. It is supposed to accuse you a little. It is supposed to force a question. When the next Semmelweis appears, whoever they are, wherever they are, in whatever field they work, will we recognize them by their evidence? Or will we recognize them only after we have first called them unstable, impolite, obsessive, naive, dangerous, impossible, embarrassing, and wrong? That is the question hidden inside every statue built in his honor. Not was he great. He was. The real question is uglier. Would you have stood with him while it still cost something? Or would you have waited until history made agreements socially safe? That is where the story lands. Not in the 19th century. Here. Now. Because Ignaz Semmelweis did more than clean the hands of medicine. He exposed how dirty the conscience of a profession can become when truth arrives in an insulting form. And if you want the final irony, here it is. The world remembers him as the man who told doctors to wash their hands. But that was never the whole message. The deeper message was this. If your status matters more to you than the people your status is supposed to protect, then your hands are never really clean. That was true in Vienna. It was true after he died. And it is still true now. So maybe the reason this story refuses to fade is not that hand washing became obvious. It is that the harder lesson never did. The harder lesson is that evidence alone does not save people. People save people. And people often fail for reasons that have nothing to do with ignorance and everything to do with pride. Semmelweis discovered a method. What he ran into was a civilization problem, a prestige problem, a conscience problem. He could wash contamination off the skin. He could not wash vanity out of the system. And in the end, that system devoured him before it finally adopted the thing he had been begging it to do. That is not just tragic. That is diagnostic. It tells you something permanent about the world. Something worth remembering the next time a simple truth arrives carrying an unbearable implication. Maybe that is why his story still feels less like history and more like warning. Because it asks one of the oldest and ugliest questions in public life. What happens when the cure is simple, the evidence is strong, and the only real obstacle is that too many important people would have to admit they were part of the disease? Ignaz Semmelweis answered that question with data. His era answered it with delay, contempt, and damage. Then later generations answered it with statues. All three answers are part of the story. Only one of them saved lives and time. And it was the answer his own world refused to give him.